George. What are we doing here? What are we doing here? It's Red Fence!
It's Red Fence.
Do your homework! Hi, Acton.
Hi, George. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you.
Yeah,
I'm gonna be mellow, because we're doing this at night, and usually we don't record at night.
that's true.
It seems a little bit crazy to be talking about daycare, given all the crazy other stuff that's going on around in the world today. But this is the homework we assigned.
So we're here to talk about it.
So I guess our first things first has to be thoughts on daycare.
I never actually went to daycare because my mom stayed home with me and my brothers until we were in high school and middle school. And while I have a lot of happy memories from my elementary school years, my memory doesn't really stretch back before 5. But I will say, one of my best friends is a marriage and family therapist, and she's known me for over 25 years. And she once made this comment to me. She said, "You're the most well-attached person I know," which is interesting in light of one of the books we're going to look at, Being There, which is all about infant maternal attachment. And so I've always taken my friend's observation about me as a compliment to my mother and not about me. My mother did a beautiful job of cultivating attachment with me when I was a baby and when I was a child. And I definitely see how that gift of attachment keeps giving, in my ability to mother my own kids and in the love and security of my marriage. The gift of good attachment has made my family relationships feel relatively easy and really natural. And things work fairly well without me having to try very hard. And that's definitely not about me. I think it's a testament to my mom and my dad. But regarding daycare, my mom actually did some part-time daycare, childcare work out of her house when I was in elementary and middle school.
I did not know that.
Yeah. I had, it's one of those things I'd kind of forgotten about it until you asked. And I was like, wait a minute. Oh yeah, my mom did that.
So you were in a daycare. It was
in a
just
sense,
your own.
It was my own house, yeah. So she watched a number of different kids over the years, mostly between the ages of 2 and 6. So no babies, but toddlers. One was the son of a single mother that my mom was friends with from church. There was the daughter of a divorced mother who had to work and that we knew from our neighborhood. And there was also like a late oops baby daughter of a friend of my mom's who had older kids that were my age. And, I have memories of my mom doing in-home childcare that it was sweet, it felt normal, it felt happy, and my mother's a very calm, easygoing person. She's very funny and gentle, and so it just felt very natural to have other kids around. It didn't feel weird at all. I don't know how much she charged for her services. I'm guessing not very much. She was the kind of person who would just do that to be nice, but I'm sure they gave her something, but probably whatever they could manage to pay, not much. But I would help out sometimes. I'd play with the kids. I'd amuse the kids. And I have this particular memory of one of the little boys, peeing all over our back steps. That was more fun than peeing in the toilet. But so there was definitely, some potty training help going on.
Oh, fun.
But, yeah, they were good times. Yeah.
My mother lied that I was potty trained to get me into the first daycare I went to.
Yeah.
She's like, oh, yeah, of course.
Of course.
I must have been, 3.5.
Had she done any? A bit?
I don't know. But her sister was there that happened to be visiting.
Okay.
And so they crash course potty trained me. And of course, when it didn't stick, at the daycare they just attributed it to being nervous for the new setting.
She's got a good cover story.
She's got a great cover story.
Yeah.
So.
But you have no memories of daycare?
I have no memories of that first daycare. I have memories of, so that would probably have been a year, or maybe not even a year before I went to kindergarten, because my mother was not having this late baby red shirt thing. That was not a thing. So I entered kindergarten when I was still 4, when I would turn 5 that November.
Okay.
My mother was not, they told her you're not old enough, and she said, you're taking her. It's it was not an option. And so the kindergarten was not all day. So I would be at daycare in the morning. The daycare would take you to the kindergarten and then pick you up.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you had the school day surrounded by daycare.
Half day kindergarten.
Right.
Okay.
So, because if you wanted to get to work early and work full time, you really needed, the school day wasn't long enough to do that. So I remember that daycare where, and it's funny because there's a version of my name, obviously we go by our pseudonyms, but there's very few people who are allowed to use one particular version of my name, and one of them happens to be the owner of that daycare.
Really?
Of the daycare that I went to, the one I remember. Yeah.
Do you stay in touch with the person who's allowed to call you?
I went back a couple times as an older person. Like, it's so crazy because, it's like they had the doorknob on the top of the door to get into the yard.
Yeah.
And as a kid, you're like unreachable. And then you go as an older person, you realize that it's like you're just raising your hand up and it's not high at all.
It's not like
taller than the sky. It's just like, oh yeah, that's normal. Yeah, that's like,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, it's all about what you know. So that was just normal for me.
Yeah.
But the story I want to tell,
Yes.
which is hilarious, is I was sitting in the bath. My mother told this to me. I do not remember this. And I said, Mom, do you know the Vagina song? And my mother just is horrified because apparently she said, and I don't know how the timing of this works, because she said like some of these stories about daycare abuse have been in the news already. And so she was like, oh my God, my child's being abused at daycare. But she decides to like keep her cool and be like, no, I don't remember that. And I'm like, the Vagina song. And she's like just trying to keep it together. And she's like, why don't you sing it? I don't remember. And I go, someone's in the kitchen vagina. Of course, you know that song. Yes. But I'm not sure our listeners. But it's Someone's in the Kitchen with Dinah.
Someone's in the
kitchen. And so my mother is just like rolling on the floor laughing. And she's like, it's with Dinah. With Dinah.
I guess I'm impressed.
And I'm like, and me is like, what's so funny?
Right. But that you would even know the word vagina.
I know, but maybe I didn't know the word vagina. Maybe I just heard the sounds and it sounded like... I don't know. But you can see how, isn't that interesting? Like that moment of panic, how all these, just it highlights the degree to which children and parents can misunderstand each other.
Yes.
Because they're learning language. Language is...
That's right.
Crazy fragile,
like, If something like your little story had happened in one of this preschool case we're talking about.
God forbid.
With a different mother.
That could have been enough.
Straight. She'd been like, my daughter is being abused because she sang the vagina song.
Right. Right.
Holy crap.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
That could have gone either way.
That is a perfect intro story.
Isn't that crazy?
It's really funny.
That's a true story, but it's a strange true story.
Yeah. This
week, as a sign, we are reading We Believe the Children, A Moral Panic in the 1980s by Richard Beck, who was, I think, a journalist, basically, who wrote this book. Mm-hmm. And Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters by Erica Komisar, who is, I think, a psychologist.
Yeah, psychotherapist.
Mm-hmm. And one of the primary threads running through both books is daycare. How parents feel about it, how children experience it, and how our perspective on daycare reveals some of our deepest values and our deepest fears about the nature of the family. My takeaway in my elevator pitch was, who we are is what we panic about.
That's good. My elevator pitch is, without strong bonds of trust, we become miserable and we lose our grip on reality.
Okay, so we're going to start with a quote from the very end of We Believe the Children. Mm-hmm. And we're calling this section, The Elimination of Sexual Hierarchy? What does that mean? Of course, the hysteria, and he's talking about all the different kinds of hysteria. The hysteria about child abuse, right? Yeah. Whether it's daycare or in your own home, repressed memories.
Yeah, stranger danger.
Stranger danger. The hysteria played on people's fears about the social changes that began to work their way through American society at the end of the 20th century. The reorganization of private life and the slow, but probably, hopefully, inexorable breakdown of the country's sexual hierarchy. But the middle-class nuclear family will not be restored to its former place, nor do most people want it to be. To imagine otherwise can only perpetuate this series of costly and destructive fantasies. So we were like, I mean, his liberal bona fides were already on the table before.
Yeah.
But that was like, what?
Yeah, most people, white people.
I try to rack my brains to think if that really is like the mainstream liberal attitude about this. I don't know anymore. I'm too confused. But anyway, like I said, the book explores, it's a lengthy and detailed history of several related phenomena during that period. So we've got the child daycare sexual abuse scandals, of discussion of multiple personality disorder, and recovered memories related to childhood sexual abuse. What all these trends have in common is that they are, at least in Beck's opinion, which I basically share, fabricated, or at a minimum, much, much rarer than they were purported to be.
Yeah.
They all share their origin in social contagion. Yes. And what happens there is once the spark is lit, these things just rage out of control. Even if we acknowledge, as I believe we must, that, child sexual abuse exists, the allegations, accusations, arrests, and the trials that took place during this period, exemplified by the most famous one of all, the McMartin preschool case in Southern California, most of these cases could not be substantiated by actual evidence. And there's some poignant examples of that we'll discuss later.
Yeah.
In particular, the way the kids were coaxed. I mean, you could call it coaching, but it's coercion, really. Yeah. Into confirming abuse allegations is so plainly unscientific that it becomes clear that there was a social force so powerful that it could override common sense at scale. So the question is, what is this social force? So Beck, who, as we said, wears his progressive bona fides on his sleeve, clearly believes that this social force is a kind of rejection of, what he hopes is the inevitable progress towards a better society. And it's better because it dismantles what is viewed as a primary source of oppression for both men and women, I might add, the nuclear family. And that's where I was like, what?
Yeah, no.
You can go what first.
So Beck is saying that the hysteria over child sex abuse in daycares played on fear over the breakdown of the nuclear family, or he calls it sexual hierarchy, which I think is a pretty lazy pejorative in my opinion. Like, family and sexual hierarchy are not synonymous, and he never proves that they are. He just sort of assumes it's obvious, gives the family a little slap in the face, and then proceeds on his way. But anyway, he's saying that this moral panic was a sublimated or misdirected way that parents and society communicated, the kids are not all right. And while we agree with Beck that the reasons the kids are not all right isn't because of mass satanic ritual abuse by daycare workers, we do believe that the parents weren't inventing the distress.
The distress of the parents.
The parents' distress was real.
Yes.
The children were not distressed until the grown-ups started messing with them, trying to extract confessions of things that never happened. But the grown-ups actually were legitimately, anxious and on edge. And that discomfort, that anxiety, the worry, the guilt over children's well-being, I think, was a meaningful signal from reality. But it got transmuted into something sensational and fictitious through this process of scapegoating. In the vast majority of cases, daycare workers were not molesting children, and certainly not in murderous satanic rituals. But that feeling, I don't think I should be dropping my kid off here, was still a legitimate parental experience. I think that's intuition. It's the gift of fear, as the author Gavin de Becker calls it. He has a book by that name. Have you read that before?
I've heard of it.
It's so good. Maybe we should do that
Maybe we should.
It's really great. That gift of fear is worth listening to, even if it's possible to misinterpret it. So blaming daycare and freaking out about possible pedophiles, it became an idiom of distress, just like multiple personality disorder did, and false recovered memories did. These are ways of communicating pain, fear, guilt, stuckness, anger, anxiety, a cry for help, and these idioms are catchable by other people. But the moral panic and social contagion don't invalidate the existence of the original distress. It just gets changed somehow. What Beck calls the hopefully inexorable breakdown of the nuclear family created, and still creates, immense distress in many people, both in parents and in children. And I can't wrap my head around why Beck feels the need to play the violin while the post-sexual revolution family is on fire and burning down. That paragraph of his, it felt like it came out of nowhere to me. Why is this good? Who says that marriage is an evil hierarchy that's doomed for destruction? And I feel like there's a bit of a misogynistic shushing of maternal concern that Beck is doing there. And it matters that he uses the word hysteria a lot, which has kind of a checkered history. He's saying, listen, ladies, you had your moment of freaking out over the supposed dangers of daycare back in the 80s, and now we all know that was bogus and ridiculously overblown. So whatever misgivings or concerns you may have about leaving your babies with strangers, just don't worry your pretty little head about it. Drop the kids off, get back to work. Don't let yourself get dragged back into childcare and sexual hierarchy, which are really the same thing, over these false fears.
I agree, and I think that as far as the general level of sexual deviance goes, Beck is actually right. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at the statistics, we can trust strangers not to sexually abuse children.
Right.
But this isn't about that, right? It's
right.
Because, and we'll never know. We weren't there. But I totally don't think anything untoward was going on at the McMartin preschool.
Right.
the things that resulted from the false accusations created this whole set of other circumstances. It being not true and people being comfortable with it being not true are not the equal, like they don't add up, right?
That's right.
And also the nuclear family, why is he on about that? I mean, that's like the exception, right? Yeah. That's the nuclear family itself was a breakdown of something else that had gone before it.
Right.
He's talking about overthrowing something that is just sort of the provable exception.
Right.
I mean, certainly the nuclear family, even at its worst, like I think of, the stories of late 19th or early 20th century drunkards who beat their wives and, their wives can't earn a living wage because of sexism and they can't control how many children they have. And, even that is still not synonymous with patriarchy because that's just like bad men and the expectations that men have towards women. Those are not equivalent.
That's right.
We know our Illich and we know the precarity that it results from selling labor for money. And we know that situation is 2 minutes old.
Right.
So I think what Beck means when he says the nuclear family is really a kind of catch-all feminist expression for mothers taking care of children in lieu of being present in the market.
Yes.
And daycare is a solution to that for some mothers. He views that as sort of the moment that a mother absents herself from the market, something fundamental has changed and it oppresses her. Which is weird considering, especially because at the school at the center of the McMartin scandal was a preschool. So this was not a panic over worrying that kids were too young to be in group care. Mm-hmm. I mean, these children would have gone from 3 or 4 years at home to probably 1 or so years, depending on their age, right, of preschool before kindergarten, which is exactly what I did.
Yeah.
So it's not framed as a debate about are the kids too young to be in care. Yeah. It's completely framed as there's a huge number of satanic individuals abusing kids on a massive scale, which was not true, was not demonstrated to be true, and also as a political story has reasserted itself in the whole Pizzagate.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Right, and QAnon and all that. Yeah.
That has been reimagined as a political story. So it's a story about it's a story that's not about children or mothers. It's about some sort of social virtue that makes us suspicious of people we don't know very well. Oh. It's a panic about the sexual deviance of strangers, not about whether infant to toddler daycare is good or bad or indifferent.
Right.
And that's interesting because it highlights, as you say, a gut-level intuition among humans that they should not trust non-kin to take care of those children.
Right.
I think this is evolutionarily hardwired into us to a large degree, and I think the moral panic is what happens when people try to override those evolved instincts.
Yeah.
The problem is, often feminism doesn't let you talk about these choices in this way. Mm-hmm. It can't be necessary for women to care for their own young children if that necessity makes them unfree to do what they want. It's unseemly to acknowledge that women are constrained in a way that men aren't. This is the feminist struggle, to unconstrain women from the asymmetric necessity that they are under. Mm-hmm. But as you point out, we've largely done this. The sexual revolution is complete. But it's arguably, I think you and I think this, it's the wrong revolution. Mm-hmm. Instead of disincentivizing women from becoming mothers, it's servitude or self-actualization, choose. We could have figured out, and I think this is what defending gender is about, how to make motherhood more feasible and more attractive to modern women.
Yes.
And this is where Beck loses both of us. We do believe that the nuclear family is one way, even if it isn't the only way, to allow mothers to flourish. The idea that it helps women who can already opt out of it to destroy it is basically bullshit feminism.
Yeah, that's BS. I agree. All right, next section. Sexual panic is anti-feminist. Really? So, another quote from Beck. Here, then, are cases in which the fear that violent pedophiles might abduct children from public places, a vanishingly rare occurrence, was used to justify the punishment of women who were looking for work, women who were at work, or women who simply thought that she and her child might both benefit from the child being allowed some time to play on his own. In other words, women whose failure to devote every moment to their role as mothers was viewed as literally criminal. There is a direct link between child abuse hysteria and anti-feminism, and the fact that such punitive measures, when criticized, are invariably described as well-intentioned, only makes them more effective and harder to roll back.
This was an interesting section because these laws, there is a rock and a hard place situation if you don't have someone else to take care of your child and you need to go to work or go to an interview or be somewhere. But I think he's looking at it the wrong way around. Beck here, he's right that we have a society where children are now viewed as unsafe when not under, adult supervision. But there's now an entire parenting movement, Live and Let Grow, that has been kindled in reaction to these overreactions that Beck describes against letting young children be out in society without a designated adult supervision. So I'm in agreement with Beck that these new norms that say children aren't safe in the world have much greater costs on poor and or single women. But even if he's correct that stranger danger has been exaggerated, the issue about childhood independence doesn't hinge on mortal danger. It hinges rather on the fact that we live radically more estranged lives from one another, adults and children, than we used to. I think we both read an excerpt from an unpublished book called, what's the title of the book? I don't remember. The Last Ones, or The Ones Who Remember, I think, maybe. Anyway, it's an excerpt from an unpublished book that Rod Dreher circulated on his Substack, and it's because he knows the author, Brian Collar, and Collar is interviewing old people in Ireland about their childhood and how different modern life is now. And I'm going to read a quote from that.
It's beautiful.
One great unmentioned casualty of the modern breakdown of trust is the close friendships that children often had with local adults. To become their own person, children need multiple role models beyond their parents, and children have them by the dozens. Carville described his friendship with a woman across the road who shared her vegetables. Bill Bergen remembered spending hours watching his village blacksmith work, and Patrick Boland remembered he and his friends, perhaps 9 or 10, scaling the fence around the nearby nurses' school and chatting with the young ladies who indulged their childlike questions. You can see this in most novels or diaries written before the last few generations. In his diary in the early 1800s, William Howlett wrote fondly of how much of his childhood was spent being mentored by kindly adults all around. We haunted the joiner's shop, chipping and boring, and endangering our toes and fingers. At another, the smith's forge was our attraction. Many a day of a cold winter did I pass by the pleasant blaze of this forge, delighting in its cheerful light, and in all the curious operations going on, such as making chains and sharpening plowshares, and so on. And many a day of a cold winter, too, did I sit cross-legged on the board of a good-natured tailor, making pincushions of a red and yellow strips of cloth. So in this context, from that perspective, a stranger meant something very specific, someone who wasn't from that place, and for that reason was not a known quantity. Right. We may live in neighborhoods now where we know the neighborhood, we recognize people, but we don't make our living from, and in a larger sense, rely on the people who live near us.
Right.
The modern world is just no longer set up that way. And this setup, I'd say, is what creates a situation where a mother, rich or poor, feels she has no other option than to keep her children in her sight at all time.
Right.
She's not in the position because she's female. She's in this position because the model that enabled people to be productive in the context of raising the next generation to be the same has been destroyed.
Yeah.
And replaced by a model where work is cut off from that possibility. And that sucks.
Yeah.
And not just for children or women. It sucks for men, too.
Yeah.
You can bet that seeing more of their children is one reason that men often also want to work from home. Mm-hmm. And that's positive. It's a move that it's entirely limited to a very narrow band of work. Most jobs require the employed person to show up somewhere away from home at a specified time.
Yeah.
And until that whole model is reconsidered, most children are going to be raised the same way most work is done, in segregated spaces designed for the purpose of their protection and education. Illich would call this childhood as a service.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's such an interesting point that the social good that we might call free-range kids is dependent on broad social trust, on knowing your neighbors in that particular kind of way fostered by mutual need and mutual help. And when we don't have that social capital, that fabric of trustworthy adults, then the definition of good mother changes into someone who can literally devote every minute of her life to being a mother, which is a helicopter mom. And this means that the role of mother in modern America is picking up the slack from what used to be shared because we could trust each other, right?
And that's basically what Illich warns against.
Yes.
That's the downside.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so the real question is, what happened to isolate and alienate us from each other? Like, what happened that makes knowing and trusting your neighbors through interdependence a rarity rather than the norm? That's what should be blamed for what Beck calls anti-feminism, or this sort of punishment of mothers who can't be on guard 24/7. And I think you're right that this change is connected to the way we work. We no longer have the kind of work that we can safely and usefully apprentice young children into. Like, think for a moment of the oddity of take your daughter to work day. Right? Like, that model of work that we have now, like away from home, doing something highly specialized that at most once a year you can bring your child to see you do, but of course she can't actually contribute to your work. Like, she'll most likely be a tag along or underfoot. But for most of history, it would have been that your daughter or your son would have been working with you and beside you as soon as they could. Like, there's a whole lot about, like, gardening and care for small animals.
Have you ever watched, like, a 2-year-old pick up acorns?
Yeah, there you
They're
go.
Just, like, you're like, pick up the acorns, and you're like, okay. And
Great.
they do it, like, you know.
Very usefully, right? There's a lot of, like, yard work, gardening, small animal care that's very kid-friendly. I mean, gathering eggs. That's, like, the quintessential, like, preschooler, like, go very carefully and get the eggs from the chickens, right? Those rhythms of subsistence living involve tasks that kids could do and be genuinely good at and contribute. Like, my grandma grew up on a farm milking cows. My dad helped my grandpa with their orchard. I remember Mary Harrington describing that weaving was traditionally like women's work in many different societies because women could do it together while chatting and while keeping like half an eye out for the little ones.
And you can pause. It's not like
there.
You can't really pause in the middle of milking a cow.
Right.
But in the middle of weaving something, you can step away.
It'll be there right for you when you come back, right? So that women could be productive and contributive economically while mothering at the same time and in the same place with company. You know, so those things are not pitted against each other. But the way we live now puts adults in one silo, you know, called work, and kids in another silo called daycare or school. And that is weird. It's unnatural. And this industrialized way of life changes the nature of mothering and makes it into something that can't be easily combined with work in one place. And that means that there are now whole new ways for mothers to fail, you know, or quote unquote fail, right? But I think it misses the point to blame pedophile hysteria for this issue of what do we do with the kids? How will they stay safe? When the problem is actually much more profound than that. Like, we've chosen to structure our economy in such a way that children become something to be watched over much, much longer than used to be the norm. And instead of kids helping us with our tasks, the kids themselves become a task.
Yeah.
And stay a task for a really long time.
That's very precise. I mean, and not only a task, they become an expensive luxury.
Yes.
Luxury viewed from the pure sense that they don't contribute to the household well-being or income.
Yeah.
I mean, to think that a child who does not eat very much could be an very energetic source of labor.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, you're getting more out of the child who can milk a cow than that child is consuming in a food.
Yeah.
I mean, we've gone from there being a net subsistence benefit to a net debt or whatever.
Yes. Yeah.
Because they cost now. Because they don't.
That's right.
They don't help the household in that way. And we've talked about this before, but I'll also add that I was watching a preview of a documentary that Jennifer Say is doing about the effect of school closures on children during COVID.
Interesting.
And because she became an early advocate to open the schools back up, believing that it wasn't justified to keep the schools closed so long. The trade-off wasn't correct. What's interesting is the way they talk about schools, they talk about it as an essential lifeline for children. Because without school, they don't have a way of being together. And it's interesting because we've said this before, that if you turn something into a service and then you take it away, it's missing. The society can't put it back on its own. And part of that is obviously, you know, the lockdown or whatever, that you weren't really allowed to congregate. But it's this idea that children don't have a place to learn and grow and be together and be with other adults anymore if it's not school. So my takeaway from watching the preview was like, oh, Illich would hate this. It's like, yeah, the school's the only place they can get together, but that's messed up.
Yes, it is.
It's like, yes, it was bad that they closed the schools, but it's a sign that their whole that all that socialization that used to take place spontaneously in a society based on its subsistence patterns
and these
is gone.
Spaces.
Which is creepy when you think about it from Illich's point of view. It's creepy.
Ooh.
It's like, because it's like because, that's sort of like a very, considered a kind of fringe viewpoint to sort of be that adamantly, to treat the school closure as a social crisis is kind of, it's considered to be, it borders on that, the government took over our lives for one virus and lied about the science or whatever. Like, it becomes quickly, it takes you out to the fringe of those opinions. But it's really funny from our Illich perspective to be like, you may think you're radical, but actually you're like, try this on for size.
Right.
Try, you shouldn't need a school to have children socialized. Try that. All right, next section. Avoiding sexual abuse creates sexual abuse. What? This was my favorite sad revelation. From We Believe the Children. This is a quote from Beck, where he's talking about when they finally get to the McMartin preschool trial. Many days were spent on the medical evidence. Astrid Heger and the other doctors who examined the children in 1983 and 1984 had used colposcopes to take photographs of the McMartin students' genitals and anuses, and now these slides were projected onto a scene in the courtroom. 2 journalists named Paul and Shirley Eberl attended almost every day of the trial, and the hours they spent staring at the colposcopic slides seemed to have marked them in ways that other aspects of the case did not. Listening to the lawyers discuss the hundreds of slides that were to be presented in the coming months, they recorded the lawyer sitting next to them as saying, "I wonder who are the real pornographers in this thing." Oof. That's the quote. This is Beck again. "That is a bit of a cheap shot, but it is true that no other photographs of the McMartin children's genitals were ever found." Later, sitting quietly and staring yet again at a, quote, blazing giant anus, a friend sat down next to them and said, "I see it's Anus Awareness Week again." This is astounding. I mean, even without the bad science that justified the use of this thing called the colposcope, which is essentially a magnifying glass, this is what Beck describes it as, essentially a magnifying device that could be hooked up to a film or video camera. And of course, it has its origins in Brazil for virginity checking. Really? Because the law was there that you could only be raped if you weren't a virgin.
Oh my word.
So, confirmed negative, awful history of that. Dear. Yeah. Okay. So even with this bad science that justified this device to confirm the presence of abuse, and with this sort of wrong theories about what was the evidence there on these children's bodies, just the sheer graphic nature of intimate examinations of these children, and then the production of these larger than life photographic evidence of these exams at court, it shows you how overwhelming the sense of evil was.
Yeah.
Like, to think that if all the adults involved in this trial thought that these kinds of means were necessary to justify the ends of justice for these kids, like, it just shows you what the stakes were, right?
Yeah.
And of course, we want to remove children from the presence of those who have or will harm them. There's not any disagreement about that. But even in the worst circumstances, there are still going to be trade-offs. Yeah. And it's just astonishing stories in this book of the trade-offs. I mean, from genital exams to the number of parents of children who were caught up in maybe initially as, possibly being victims because they had a connection to the school, who then themselves ended up being accused of abuse and losing their children to the state.
Right.
Which, by the way, means you're letting strangers care for your kids.
Exactly. Ah! Yeah. Oh.
So, equally astonishing are the parents who, despite the initial denials and obvious coercion of their own children, remained convinced beyond any doubt that their children had been abused. Mm-hmm. So this kind of behavior clearly taps into something beyond logic, beyond the questions of true and false. Mm-hmm. It taps into some primal need to believe that the world is some certain way. Mm-hmm. I don't know why you would believe it is full of satanic sexual predators, But these parents never lost that conviction.
Right.
When the case was finally over, they hired a crew to explore the McMartin preschool site because the owner, it had changed hands and the owner was going to demolish it anyway. So it was like, sure, you want to go look for the magic tunnels? You can go look for the magic tunnels. But that's what they're doing. They were hiring like an investigative team of construction analysis people or whatever.
Diggers to dig up
exactly,
the whole site.
in the hopes of finding evidence at last of these infamous tunnels that supposedly allowed secret transit to sites where these unspeakable acts occurred. So true belief like that is unshakable. Yeah. It doesn't matter that nothing happened at that preschool.
Right. Something
far larger happened to all the parents, police, media, lawyers, jurors, etc. involved in that case.
Yeah.
So it's hard to describe what that is, but it's real in the sense that it had real effects. Yeah. I don't understand where that comes from. Where you take the surety that your child has been a victim rather than not. I mean, perhaps it's easier to double down on that story than it is to trust that nothing happened in the face of the allegations that something did. I mean, it's that you can never prove a negative, or...
Yeah. Maybe the desire for closure. Like, I know that this happened. I don't know.
It's very strange.
Yeah. But
we can certainly see the same kind of surety in parents who are committed to their own trans children. Jeanette Jennings, who's Jazz Jennings, his actual name is Jared. She's the most famous mother of a son to undergo early medicalized intervention to affirm her son's belief that he's actually a girl. Yeah. She doesn't have any doubts that she did the right thing. Mm-hmm. She surely believed she was protecting him by lying to him consistently that he could be a girl. What she did is wrong, even before the puberty blockers. But what I'm trying to point out here is that in trying to keep him innocent, the innocence that, of course, puberty then goes on to erase and probably would have resulted in Jared realizing he was gay. And so in this quest to keep him innocent, they actually sexualized him in the most extreme way possible. So I'm making a comparison here between, like, the kids who were coerced into giving these interviews about sexual acts and then had their genitals examined. Yeah. That's the comparison I'm making. So there's this truly sickening moment when Marcy Bowers, who is a male surgeon who is also trans-identified and has been also surgically altered in the pursuit of a false womanhood, although as an adult. Mm-hmm. I was about to say she. God, that's terrible! I'm brainwashed! He is inspecting Jazz's so-called neo-vagina. This is, like, after the initial surgery, but there were several surgeries.
Yeah.
So he is examining him, and including taking pictures. And he jokes that, given the amount of attention to Jazz's private parts, she, would say he, could be a porn star.
I saw that video. It's sick. Like, the grown-ups
are
crazy.
Laughing.
Like, they're laughing.
It's crazy.
It's just like, this is so wrong.
And that's that person's everyday reality.
Yeah.
So I think it's correct to identify these sorts of images, even if they come from medicalized settings, as a kind of pornography. Mm-hmm. But it's a special new sort. Because it's not directly related to debasing prostitutes. But it's based on the idea that the sexual innocence of a child can only be assured if it is intimately witnessed, probed, and in the extreme case of Jazz Jennings, altered in such a manner that it is never allowed to be anything but immature.
That's so sad.
I mean, this is a genital surgery that is taking place under the context that it was never even designed for. I mean, not like it should be designed for anyone at all, but the adult penile inversion, which is the traditional surgery that is done on men who want to pretend to be women. At 17, Jazz is going to undergo this, but his penis, because he'd been puberty blocked, is still the size of a 9-year-old's.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, because that was the hormones that would have matured his genitals were blocked. It's that odd counterpoint between this kind of enforced innocence, but this, really over-sexualized result from that. Mm. So the perceived threats against innocence not only justify, but indeed require the use of these invasive procedures. So the colposcope or the surgery, it's like, we have to keep these children innocent. And then, I mean, what that lawyer said is like, I wonder who the real pornographers are here. Like, right. That is so right on.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
Because it was the state mandating that.
Right. The only
it was, and those are the
pictures taken by the state.
And one of the things, if you read the book, that they talk about over and over in the interviews was all the photographs being generated, but they were never ever like. Oh. I mean, what photographs? Like, Beck's right about that. It's a zinger. That one's a zinger. Yeah. And so, like those reporters in the courtroom, and anyone who has watched I Am Jazz, there is an instinctual disgust at this trade-off, no matter how well-intentioned the people participating in it are. Yeah. But it's not easy, in the case of the McMartin preschool trial, to articulate why it is better to not, as the title of the book goes, believe the children. And that believe the children is the same thing they say when they're talking about quote-unquote trans children.
Yes.
We believe the children. It is the same refrain.
Yes.
And Beck wrote this book, I think, too early for him to have known that. I think it's from 2006.
Oh, interesting.
I think it's too early.
Before it exploded.
So it requires an entirely different kind of mentality about what role children play in society and how they mature, like for the purpose of eventually replacing the adults that bore and raised them. It seems normal now to us to assume that any adult might have a prurient interest in a child he isn't related to. But this isn't normal. Right? This isn't normal. It's in fact really new. And Keller remarks on this actually in the excerpt. And I really hope this book gets published so we can read it all. And I think he's absolutely right. This assumption of sexual interest can only take place in a world where we've realized that children aren't considered necessary to society, which is, of course, ipso facto false, because society ends when people start having children. And therefore, no one but the few people to whom they are individually precious value them at all. So I'm not arguing that some individual adults weren't creepy or nasty or downright abusive towards children, but what I think I am arguing is that a society where children are valued in that way is ultimately a better trade-off. Safety, when taken too far, becomes its own kind of abuse. Innocence is real, but it must also be risked in order for childhood to yield to adulthood. Yeah. And how you manage this risk is the difference between free-roaming children and moral panic, complete with invasive genital photos, or, in Jazz's case, surgeries. It doesn't matter, then, that we can usually trust strangers not to sexually abuse our children, as I said earlier. What matters is we don't. We don't.
Right.
Like, we just don't.
Yeah. So it's not about how things actually are. It's that within ourselves, we can't trust.
We viscerally understand risk-benefit situations, and we know that if everyone in our village has a shared reliance on each other, that we are more likely to share values that promote those things. It's for you need to mind other people's children because it somehow much more directly affects your well-being.
That's right. And because we don't rely on one another in the same way, we don't trust one another in the same way, and so we can't entrust our children to other people.
And also, it must have been that, in networks where all the children knew each other and there was a creepy adult, all the children would just say, that's the creepy adult. Like, let's
avoid so
never go there alone.
Right. Yeah.
Like, the children would learn that really quickly.
So you're pointing to this disturbing reality that the story of what's going on with the children is inevitably a story about what the adults believe, right? The adults' beliefs end up shaping and massaging the narrative, even in some cases, creating the narrative out of nothing. And that was something that I found horrifying about the McMartin trial parents, as well as the therapists and the police officers who interviewed the children. They assumed that sexual abuse happened, and so they asked the kids leading questions. They examined them for hours at a time and planted ideas and phrases into their minds. And what mattered most to the adults involved was not reality, and it was also not necessarily even the children's well-being. It was the reinforcement of this narrative that had captured them. And it was so compelling that they took ungodly amounts of photos of toddlers' anuses. They destroyed the lives and reputations of many innocent people. They made their own lives revolve around this all-consuming story of trauma that turned out to be made up. And it was all started by this one particular mother who was later discovered to be alcoholic and schizophrenic and a pretty unreliable narrator, although that did not come out during the trial. I think no one really knew. I don't think the
parents had any knowledge that was the source of the original allegations.
I don't think so. But what's crazy is, even if they had known, I don't think it would have mattered. It took on a life of its own. is what the moral panic was. It just, once it got kickstarted, I mean, she was the fuse that started it, but then it just had a life of its own. But this woman, she thought that her son had like a redness on his bottom, and so she became afraid that he'd been abused. And I don't know if he ever even. The only things that we know that boy said are the mother saying, "My son said, such and such," and the stories got crazier and crazier over time. The things that she said, he said, but all it took was that one suspicion, one accusation, and then the floodgates just opened. I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about this flip that happens when you no longer have an idea, but an idea has you. It's this form of ideological possession. And I think when you're possessed like this, you become capable of doing damaging things, even evil things, in the name of a good cause, right? Like believing the wrong story can make good and evil flip places. And that's a really terrifying thought to me. I think it's really sobering. That these people desperately trying to protect children ended up hurting children because they believed beyond rationality, without any meaningful evidence, in a false story that somehow became necessary to them. And it shows that good intentions aren't enough. You need to be willing to change your mind. I'm sure you've heard of Peter Boghossian. And
of course.
Yeah, he does this thing called street epistemology, where he has conversations with people on the street and records them, puts them on the internet. And he asks them questions to find out not just what they believe about controversial topics, but how strongly they believe, why they believe, and particularly under what conditions or in light of what evidence might they ever be willing to change their mind. And that last question is really the key, because it's the dividing line between like opinions and facts on one side, and then I think religious beliefs on the other. Like, if you have an opinion about something or a certain interpretation of events or facts, you ought to be able to say, well, if someone could show me XYZ evidence to the contrary, I'd change my mind. But if there is absolutely nothing that anyone could show you or say to you that would change your belief, then it's a matter of faith. It's religious. It's non-negotiable. It's sacred. It's not the kind of thing that one can examine and then revise because it's somehow like too central to you, or it's transcendent over you in some way. You are beholden to it. Right? It's not the kind of thing you can change your mind about, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad or false. Like, I have religious beliefs, that are outside the realm of empirical evidence. I think most people probably do, of some sort. But a question like, was this child sexually abused, shouldn't be a matter of faith. It should be a matter of evidence. And a question like, is this child a boy or a girl? Will this child be better off with or without a natural puberty, with or without their natural genitals, with or without natural fertility? That too should be an empirically testable, verifiable question and not an article of faith. It should be the kind of thing a person could change their mind about. And so that's why that believe the children is the wrong mantra for both the satanic panic of the 80s and for the question of trans kids today. No, we should definitely not believe the children all the time. And because in both cases, the children learn to parrot back the words and the narratives and the frameworks that the adults have given to them. Kids will learn to tell us what we expect to hear. The grown-ups hold the keys. The grown-ups' stories set the tone. And so believing the children is really just a delayed form of confirmation bias, right? It's tautological. We put the narrative in, we get the narrative out. And those preschoolers who sat through hours of leading questions eventually learned that saying, no, Mr. Ray never touched my pee-pee or took off my clothes. Like, that wasn't going to get them anywhere.
Yeah, they weren't going to let these kids stop until they...
No.
Which is crazy.
It's very crazy. I mean, they were stuck answering the same questions over and over. They couldn't go home for dinner until the grown-ups got the story they wanted. And so all the kids, one by one, figured out what they had to say to get what they wanted, which was for the ordeal to end, or for the grown-ups to be happy and excited, right? Because they get, if they tell a really interesting story, the grown-ups get all... say more.
Let's go dredge the river for those dead babies.
Exactly. So and over time, the stories the kids told about the supposed abuse not only began to be full of adult language, words that kids of that age would never think of or use on their own, right? But they also became increasingly surreal and fantastical, like people floating through the air, the dismemberment of animals, drinking blood, flying on airplanes out of state, underground tunnels, dozens of murders, babies or grown-ups, like... The kinds of things that clearly show that a few of those kids were just kind of going to town with this for whatever reason. I don't know. But they were leading the grown-ups on by the nose. And I've listened to many stories from parents of trans teenagers who say that when their child starts to talk to them about their trans identity, the child ceases to sound like himself or herself. They start to sound like they're reading off of a script. They're using borrowed words, and when questioned about their statements, the teens can't really go any deeper or more personally with it. They get kind of flustered and they just repeat the lines, right? And that's what the kids are doing. They're following online influencers, grown-ups who've given them tips on, how to talk to your parents or what to say so that your parents will give you a binder or will use your pronouns or will take you to the gender clinic, right? They coach kids on what to say to therapists so that the therapists will sign off on getting the kid puberty blockers or getting the teen cross-sex hormones. It's a loop. It's one set of grown-ups feeding the narrative to the kid, and the kid shares the narrative to another set of grown-ups to get the results they want, because the trans kid or the trans teen has decided that there is only one way to relieve their very real distress.
And that's like an exact parallel. Like the social workers put it in the minds of the children, and the children repeated it to the court.
That's right.
And the jury was like, this is bullshit.
Yes.
I mean, the jury was like totally unconvinced by the testimony in particular of the children.
Right.
Like, just not convinced.
And thank God.
Right, but see, and the reason that was, they weren't
in this loop of
they
the
weren't
story.
in the loop.
Yeah. And I've heard detransitioners describe this process too, of how they went online, they found out what they had to say to get what they wanted, and then they proceeded to fool the adults or badger them or coerce them or emotionally blackmail them into affirmation therapy. I remember one detransitioner in her story, she described like rolling her eyes at just like how totally credulous her therapist was. She's like, I just got these lines right off the internet. I just said them. And my therapist was like, oh yes, right away. I'll do, kowtowing to her, and there are other detransitioners who are so angry that the adults allowed themselves to hand the reins over to the kids. I mean, Chloe Cole has talked about that, like with indignation, like, why did you listen to me? How could you let me drive the bus? I was 13. What the hell were you thinking? Why did you believe me?
Yeah.
How could you believe me?
Yeah. So. Because they wanted to believe them. I mean, because they already, yeah.
It's like, what is that in people that they can get so attached to a story? And I have to believe that ability to become so enraptured with a narrative, even if it's a terrible one. And in both cases, these are really sad ones.
They have bad trade-offs.
Bad trade-offs. Yes.
I mean, I can understand being really fervent about something that you believe you cling to because you're convinced that it has ultimate benefits. Like, yes. I can understand perhaps, like, clinging to the idea that most people in the world are good. Because you need that.
Yeah.
Like, you need to believe, a lot of people need to believe that in order to function.
Right.
But that generally, the risk-benefit to that is usually net positive.
Right.
But these beliefs
ones seem
net negative.
But there's part of me that like I don't want to demonize people who get caught in who the idea gets them, because I feel like that's probably something that all of us could potentially fall into. Like,
well,
in a
it's
sense,
for the children for sure. I think that it's the parents. It doesn't matter. There doesn't seem to be a vaccine. I mean, this seems to be an equal opportunity.
That's what I'm trying to say, right?
It doesn't. There doesn't seem to be something a parent can do besides maybe not send their kid to public school or private school. Yeah. Or any school.
Homeschooling.
Yeah. It doesn't seem to be a lot to avoid, or maybe just never let them on the internet. It's like, you ever see Super Size Me?
Oh, yeah.
Right, where he talks about in the movie how he says, even if you feed your kids 3 meals a day, the amount of commercials they watch, it's like several orders of magnitude more. Like, there's just so many more repetitions of eat bad food coming from the advertising than there is eat good food coming from even from, like, the environment you live in.
Yeah. It's
a ratio. Mm-hmm. And that ratio exists if you give your kid a phone.
Right.
You're
that's right.
Your teachings are a you
That's right.
And
you just shrunk your influence down to that by handing them a phone.
Exactly. Yes. Because it's just a tsunami of whatever they're getting on that versus like the 5 times a day you tell them whatever.
And this is why my children don't have phones.
Yeah.
Because I want to have the megaphone for my values.
Yeah. No.
Switch to being there.
Let's talk about early childhood mothering. So I quoted one sort of negative review of this book on Amazon in our homework assignment. I'm going to quote another one. This book definitely promotes the idea of mother as martyr and completely negates the idea that women are actual human beings with thoughts, feelings, and needs outside of their offspring, nor that there are fathers who play active and nurturing roles in their children's lives. She passes a lot of judgment on women who aren't able to stay home while offering very little tangible advice for people who can't or don't want to give up their careers to still foster securely attached development in their children. If people had to read this before getting pregnant, no one would have children. While I certainly found much of what she wrote validating to my own life choices, I wouldn't want my daughter to grow up to feel like having a child means sacrificing all of her own needs in perpetuity. So the title of this review is Lots of Judgment with Little Tangible Advice. And there's no doubt that Commissar is saying that children need their mothers in the earliest years of life. But how does that thesis statement get transformed, even by a woman who has made the choice to basically stay home, right? In line with what Commissar advocates. How does that get transformed into exaggerations such as women aren't human beings, or having children is a perpetual sacrifice, or that making observations about cause and effect is a kind of passing judgment? It just seems as if this reviewer is saying the book isn't good because it's going to upset people. Which is an odd measure of book. Because she is saying that, like, the quote is like, she passes a lot of judgment on women who aren't able to stay home while offering very little tangible advice for people who don't want to give up their careers to still foster securely attached development in their children. Her thesis is that you can't do that. She's saying her thesis is judgment. Like, her thesis that you can't do it is she's judging people who don't do it. It's like, she's not really judging you. She's just, I mean, is that judgment to say this doesn't work? Input A, is that judgment, or is that just statement of fact?
You can take it personally.
I guess
Clearly she took it personally. But, I mean, the reviewer is also flat out wrong about the book not having tangible advice for people who want to have kids but don't want to give up their career. And I know this because I actually found myself getting a little bored reading, like, page after page of, like, highly detailed advice on exactly what a full-time working mother could do to bond with her baby as much as possible. I mean, the whole mom just came home scenario is really scripted out in detail.
Right.
They're highly detailed.
Right.
And the book has a whole section on what stay-at-home fathers can do to bond with and nurture their babies. So the book was extremely specific and practical, and it definitely spoke to people who were making, in Commissar's opinion, less than ideal choices. So all I can think is that the reviewer didn't bother to read the whole book.
Possibly.
So I don't know. Or maybe she just glossed over those parts because she felt so judged. I don't know. I'm not
or
sure.
She felt, it was worse than
others
that, right?
were being
she
judged.
felt others were being judged. That's
right.
really
That's interesting.
that's the hook of the feminism, right?
Yeah.
Because remember, the moment the woman has to inconvenience herself at all because she has a baby, that's oppression. That's the standard.
Yeah. I mean, I think the reviewer is correct that readers are likely to feel judged because Commissar sets a really high bar for what babies need. But the high bar on bonding with your baby is backed up by a lot of scientific evidence and research studies. This is not just her opinion. So I think it's accurate to say this book might make you feel bad about your life choices, but you can't say this book is factually incorrect. And nothing in the book made me feel as though being a mother means I don't have thoughts, feelings, or needs outside of my offspring. Like, the book reminded me that being a mother is a really big deal. So it made me feel super necessary and extremely valuable. That might feel stifling to some women if you're, like, not replaceable, right? That could be like, oh, I feel amazing, I'm not replaceable. Or it could be like, I'm not replaceable, get me out. That could feel awful,
right.
or it could feel like amazing. It depends, right? I personally found it encouraging because I've devoted 16 years of my life to doing the kinds of things that she recommends. And it's not because I read her book, it's because those are the things I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. So of course I have a bias towards thinking that she's correct because I've done the things she's advised, and I've been happy. So obviously I have a bias in that way. But I think it is kind of reveals the subculture that I grew up in, but I find it bizarre that there are women who assume that you can just tack a baby onto your life and not be totally rearranged by it. The Christian world I was raised in had a very high regard for mothering and an awareness of how much work and joy was involved in it. So Commissar was presenting advice that seemed obvious to me, but she presented it like it was revelatory. And maybe it is revelatory for people who come from a different subculture, but reading her book opened my eyes to how parenting aware or parenting focused evangelical and Catholic cultures are. Like, Christian culture takes this really seriously. Like, for better and for worse, I think, because there are plenty of single Christian women or married Christian women who aren't mothers who can end up feeling judged or lesser than, because highly invested mothering is kind of a high status thing in Christian circles, in the way that being like a high octane career woman is a high status thing in secular circles. So it's interesting to me to see the different sets of criteria by which women are judged based on their subculture. Like, success in one subculture would be like compromise or failure in the other. Isn't that interesting?
That's an interesting...
Yeah.
I don't know if the question was ever asked, will the kids be okay if mothers work? The question that was being asked by feminism was, we shouldn't have to do this just because we're women. It doesn't seem like the question was asked from the perspective of children. It doesn't seem like the question was asked. It feels like, in hindsight, why is Commissar's book a revelation? Because it's saying that no matter how feminist you are, you can't make something so that isn't so. Like, just because you have an orientation towards the world and you have right to have your career and all that, it doesn't abrogate the facts on the ground. That is, your child is going to feel this particular way about you.
That's right.
But I don't think feminism was interested in that. I think feminism was reacting to this idea that, the Betty Friedan thing. Like, we're going to get into that right now, right?
Yep.
So this next section, from feminine mystique to career woman mistake. This is from the preface of Commissar's book. The truth is, we can do everything in life, but not at the same time. We cannot raise healthy children if we are not there for them emotionally and physically. We cannot be present for them while being intensely involved with work or other interests that make us less mindful of and attentive to the emotional needs of our children. And while this is a book about the well-being of our children, it is also about the happiness and well-being of their mothers. We can have all the career success we have ever dreamed of, but every mother knows that when our children suffer, we suffer too. If we have all the career success in the world, but our children resent us, or worse, are disabled by our insensitivity or lack of empathy towards their needs when they are young and become depressed, anxious, or cannot form and sustain deep emotional connections with others, are we truly satisfied as mothers? Being framed from, have your career, but you can't do both. You can't have your career at the moment your child is young.
Or if you do, the baby's
and if you do, there's going to be trade-offs.
Yeah.
And she says, I think in interviews, she's when people say, oh, but there's plenty of children who were raised, in daycare and are fine. And she says, well, someone always survives a shipwreck. Oh. That's her answer. It's like, mileage varies.
Yes. Yeah, just true.
So, she's basing this book on data. Some of it, her experience from her own work. Some of it, some studies. So how accurate or relevant you think this data is, that's another story. But she's not saying that women need to stay home for their children because it's their destiny or all they are suited for. She's not making, Betty Friedan was correct that there was a lot of misogyny in the social attitude that women could only be fulfilled by wifedom and motherhood.
Right.
But it's not misogyny to suggest that children need their mothers. And I think that's the crux that we're working on here, right? And yet the reaction to someone like Commissar, who is arguing that mothers need to choose their children because their children don't have a choice, they can't not need their mothers, it seems to come from that same place of rage against misogyny. That's that reviewer saying, you're judging me for wanting my career. And it's like, no, we're just saying that this is trade-offs, significant trade-offs.
Yeah.
And some women, it seems, don't want to hear that they cannot have it all at the same time. I wonder whether people will be more persuaded by data than by a traditional argument, though.
I think so.
And there's a new book out, which I think is trying to do this. We'll probably do it in a future episode, called The Two-Parent Privilege, which, like this book, seems to be reframing what were previously moral arguments about child rearing and to defend them now based on the data that they work better for children. Yeah. So it's no longer about patriarchy, but rather about social privilege. And in the case of The Two-Parent Privilege, it's about being married when you raise your kid.
Yeah.
We'll have to read that book to know whether its author, this woman whose last name is Kennedy, acknowledges any connection between arguments of tradition and the argument she's making now. Are we so blinded by the sexual revolution that we cannot even imagine the idea that social norms were valued because people did realize they created better outcomes? I mean, isn't that, I think that would be just sort of obvious. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the feminist idea is that, no, marriage and all these norms in place that are preventing women from being sexually free or free to pursue a career without, any pressure to marry or have children, those are just about oppression. They're just about, that seems to be the message. Mm-hmm. Whereas, so now these books have to recoup it, somehow saying, oh, it's not, it's actually about, it's odd, right? Because now it's framing it as this different kind of oppression of the disadvantaged children who don't have the advantage of the two-parent family. So it's...
All these moves we do to make it sciencey instead of moral, because we just can't bear to have a moral conversation.
Well, we can have a moral conversation. Right. We can have a moral conversation when it comes to the disadvantaged children, but we can't have a moral conversation when it comes to telling a woman her place is in the home.
Right.
Okay. Anyway, broadly, I think there is a chance that Commissar's arguments could be more successful because they make a data-driven argument if younger women hear them before they enter the workforce. Mm-hmm. My favorite part of the book is where she advises young women to think about what their values and preferences are before they have children, or at least before they give birth. She's advocating realistic expectations and warning women that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Meeting the needs of a baby and young child will require sacrifice. Yeah. I feel it's so much better to be honest about that.
Yeah, I agree. And I couldn't read Being There without being conscious of my personal experience of the things that she was talking about. I always knew that I wanted to be home full-time with my children when they were young, and for me that has meant homeschooling them up through middle school. And I had that expectation and preference since I first started having crushes on boys. Like I always wanted to mother the way that I was mothered, by being there. And it definitely helped that I got married at 20, and that my first job after college, I coordinated cancer research studies. It was a stressful job, and it was just not sustainable for me. I did it for 4 years, and it was an important job. I learned a lot from it, but I was counting the days until I could get pregnant and leave. I really was. Like, I don't know what it would have been like if I'd found my way into a satisfying, beloved career path by the age of 26, when my first child was born. It might have been a whole lot harder to set it aside for a decade and a half. So looking back, I'm actually grateful that I didn't find my vocation of writing until my youngest kids were 5. So I didn't fall in love with a kind of work until I had already done the lion's share of the most intensive parenting that I knew I wanted to do. And so that made the path I had wanted to take, it just made it a whole lot easier. I was not conflicted about it. So the choice to be there full time, it didn't even feel like a choice to me. It felt obvious because I didn't like my job, and we were committed to living very frugally so that my income wasn't necessary. I actually, at the time when I decided to not go back to work after my maternity leave ended, my husband had actually lost his job at that point. He did not have a job.
Scary.
But I did not go back. And so we actually floated for a little while until he found a new one. But we were both like, I was like leaking milk and like up all night with my baby. I was like, there is no way in hell I'm going. Like we were symbiotically one being. Like, there is no way I'm going to work. It was just, and he and I recognized the impossibility of that.
Right.
This is not happening, even though he didn't have a job. And so, thank God we had some savings. But yeah, and it has been tight for years and years. I mean, it's not tight anymore, but in those early years, it was really tight. And so now I have a growing career with older kids, and it's a delight. And I don't feel inner conflict about it because the timing is really good. And I was conscious that I was intentionally doing one thing at a time, and I just reveled in being with my babies. And I think it's the best thing I've ever done. And I love that part of my life. And I agree with you that Commissar's book is best read by women before they have children, even before they marry. I think the sooner the better. And I think Friedan's style of feminism was kind of appalled that motherhood was glorified into too big of a deal. And so it responded by like sidelining and downplaying motherhood. But like Commissar shows, mothers may think they can invest less in their babies, but the babies don't agree. Like, babies' needs are just the same as they've always been. Like, they didn't get the feminist memo in the 60s and 70s. They still want mama, lots of her, especially for the first 3 years. The more mama, the merrier. I mean, that's not going to change because of Betty Friedan.
Well, and it's hard because you're right. I mean, if you have to give up something, a career that you love, and the train is gonna move on.
Yep.
And you're not gonna be able to get that same thing back. You have to.
It depends. Certain careers are like that. Others aren't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have to take. Although, okay, so that would be our sort of based plan would be to understand that motherhood really does expect that level of sacrifice, because Not because motherhood equals sacrifice in the sense that not because it's not valid that you love something else.
Right.
But because of the competing needs, the child is the one whose needs cannot be delayed.
That's right. That's right.
The child is supposed to win. And Commissar gives a very convincing argument about that, because if you invest that time, the earlier time is not replaceable.
That's right.
And I think, honestly, this was one of those things that if it happened at scale, would be so much more successful. It's like the inverse of the story of it's like the opposite of, when more women began to work outside the home, the two income thing. Mm-hmm. Like in the initial stage, when only a few number of people were doing it, it was a definite advantage because it raised your income level noticeably above married couples who weren't doing that. But then when everybody started doing that and housing prices just adjusted, it just led to this.
People are caught.
It led to the entire society, everybody working more and paying more for the same houses that they would have if no one had done that. Mm-hmm. It was sort of like a tragedy of the commons in a weird way.
Yes.
And so in the inverse, if women routinely took 3-year breaks or whatever in the workforce, in that manner, then an entire sort of normal kind of churn would develop around that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it would be like re-entry jobs for women who had done maybe most of their professional training, mm-hmm. their school before they get pregnant, but then had taken, anywhere from 3 to 10 years out of the workforce. Like you could design an entire thing around that, including like continuing education when you were out of the workforce. You could design that into the way that you could normalize that. Yeah. If it was being done at scale. Right.
But to do that, you have to really admit that men and women are really different, and their bodies are really different, and it would destroy all the efforts at the shrinking the gender pay gap and all of that. Right? Like you just have to be like, we're just different. Women are going to make less because they're taking 10 years off.
It's a childhood.
It's what's happening.
Right.
For the babies. Yeah. Right. So I think there's an ideological we can't go that way because that will destroy this cherished belief.
Possibly. Yeah. Okay. Next section, motherhood and childhood. Motherhood and the village. So this was one of the things that I found a little bit inside baseball to her field.
Right, because she's a therapist.
Right. And she's a specific kind of therapist. She's kind of a very Freudian type. So Commissar repeatedly argues that not finding infant care fulfilling is, in some sense, a sign of something psychologically awry with the mother. Mm-hmm. In particular, she believes that a woman's relationship with her own mother has a lot to do with it. And she goes into a lot of detail about this, not all of which I found that convincing. Mm-hmm. In fact, I'm more convinced by her broader observations about how society has changed, specifically around the experience of motherhood. Here's a quote from her. Mm-hmm. The most common form of postpartum depression I see comes in the form of mothers who can't take being with their babies for too long. Many women who have only had to care for themselves their entire lives may feel frustrated and overwhelmed when they have to put their own needs on hold to care for a new baby 24 hours a day. They want to run away or go back to work, back to the life they had before. It's a kind of denial that their lives have changed forever. Mm. So the question begged here for me is why women have only had to care for themselves. Yeah. Mary Eberstadt addresses this issue and talks about how lower fertility rates have changed the exposure that women have to children before they become mothers. In previous generations, many more women would have been involved in caring for siblings or other younger relatives. Yeah. So mothers are now less familiar with what it means to care for an infant. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, they are more isolated. This is another quote. Mm-hmm. At one time, most new mothers had many women around them before, during, and after birth. Mothers, aunts, sisters, cousins, grandmothers, and even neighbors shared stories of their own birth experiences and made nourishing meals so that new mothers could recover their strength after labor. Mm-hmm. They took care of the house and cooking so that the mother could get to know her new baby. They taught new mothers that breastfeeding takes time and explained how to do so comfortably. They alleviated their concerns and cared for their babies so that they could get some much-needed sleep. In our society, we have lost the circle of love among women, which leaves mothers isolated, confused, and alone at a time when they need care and support the most. Family often lives far away. A woman's mother or mother-in-law may come for a week or a few days or not at all. Sometimes she's not welcome. So is it psychological or sociological? And probably it's both, right? But I think I'm more personally interested in the sociological.
Yeah.
I think there's so much we can do for one another as women that can even out some of those individual idiosyncrasies, such as whatever might have happened to the new mother with her mother when she was young.
Right.
I think communal support is far more likely to change outcomes than therapy is, at least from the point of view of the child being better supported by his or her mother. Mm-hmm. I'm certainly not against therapy, but I don't see better individual adjustment ultimately relieving the loneliness of a mother who's raising her children without adequate support.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the larger and the deeper problem is the loss of intergenerational local family networks of support, otherwise known as the gendered world of women, right? It's important to remember that therapy is new in the history of humanity. Like, therapy showed up like 5 minutes ago, and in my opinion, I think it's an immune system response to social conditions that are inhumane, that are making us psychologically ill. And I'm not saying that no one had anxiety, depression, or postpartum depression until the turn of the century, but the older, gendered, small-scale, interconnected way of life, while it was tougher physically, I think it was much easier and more straightforward and satisfying on an emotional and psychological level than modern life. People's bodies suffered more, but I think their psyches suffered less because they were more rooted in stable systems of meaning and stable structures of communal support. So modern therapy, I think, is compensating for the lack of family connection, lack of friendships, lack of religion, and lack of meaning that a lot of people suffer from. And so while therapy is a good idea for a mother with postpartum depression, it's not enough. Like, that kind of therapy, I think, is more like a tourniquet to stop the bleeding on a case-by-case basis, but it doesn't prevent each new vulnerable mother from being wounded by isolation and overwhelmed by how unsuited she feels for the role, It was hard for me, even though I, had a great relationship with my mother.
Right.
Especially having that first baby, I felt like I was hit by a truck. It was really hard, and my mother was many states away, and could come to visit a little bit. But, it was hard just because it's hard.
Right.
Not because of some psychological maladjustment or something.
Right.
It's just the work is hard. And, I think our work-focused society is very anti-maternal and anti-natalist. And if we only give struggling mothers therapy, but we don't change the social priorities and structures, then we're kind of saying, ladies, this is all in your head, instead of admitting, ladies, we are failing you as a society. Mothers deserve better support than we're giving them. But to touch on what you mentioned first, Commissar is saying that if a woman doesn't find her own baby interesting and engaging, then there's something going wrong inside the mother related to how she herself was mothered. I will say that did make some sense to me, and I say that because I was mothered very attentively by a mother who took obvious and deep delight in me and in my brothers, and so I have felt her joy and her attention as a gift that has made my mothering feel natural and spontaneous. Like, I like being a mother, and I like my kids, in part because my mother liked me. And so there's this apprenticeship aspect to maternal attachment. It's like this gift that keeps on giving. But again, the story behind the story of a mother being able to give herself joyfully to her children is that she herself must be supported, by a good husband, by female family members, by a community. All that love is poured into the mother by others. And that is what enables her to give her so much and so deeply for so long to meet the baby's enormous needs. Like, she can't do that by herself. No woman can. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the book's negative reviews are coming from women who recognize that they don't have adequate support networks to be able to give what Commissar is telling them their baby needs.
Or maybe they don't. They think that she's criticizing them. But
You're not good enough.
Right. Maybe that's it. They don't realize that they don't know where it has to come from.
Right. It's not from you as an individual.
Exactly.
Right. It's the network. It's the network's responsibility. Yeah. And, it's interesting, like, Commissar comes out pretty strongly in saying that, daycare is a really poor option for kids 3 and under. And not because they might be abused there. That's not at all. She calls daycare a last resort, and she encourages women to either stay home with their babies or to have another family member watch them, maybe dad, maybe grandma, or to hire a nanny, or if you can't afford that, share a nanny with other families. Anything to keep the ratio small and to keep the person constant, right? Any of these options before choosing daycare, she says. And she says the primary issue with daycare is that the babies need to emotionally bond and attach to a primary caregiver. But the worker-to-child ratio and the high turnover of daycare workers both mitigate against that attachment happening during the daytime. And she says that quality time is a myth, that babies and toddlers need quantity time with mom, not just an hour playtime before bed and a tuck-in. So she's calling women to recognize the huge emotional needs of infants that can't be skimped on without some pretty bad consequences for the child down the road. So I can see why full-time working mothers would take offense, because I think she is doing a little bit of the dreaded mommy shaming, which is so painful for women. But I think what you and I would want to do with this is not shame mothers, but shame the societies and the communities that are supposed to be supporting and helping mothers so that they can be present when it matters most. And I've always thought that since a mother is the environment for her baby, the only way she can be a good environment is if she herself is in a good environment, right? She can love well if she is loved well. And I think it's Louise Perry who says that liberalism's myth of the autonomous individual can't survive contact with motherhood. But perhaps another way to describe postpartum depression is that mothers can barely survive abandonment by a liberal order that expects them to act like autonomous individuals instead of like the mothers they've become. You know, like to what degree is postpartum depression like not even about the woman, but it's like she's bearing the cost of the broader social order having left her on her own, you know, like that it's not, in that sense, it's not really about her or necessarily about like how she was mothered or something, but like she's the drain that all of the social orders, like anti-maternal, we don't give a shit, we're all individuals out here, all that sentiment drains down into the mother abandoned, you know, with her baby and exhausted. And I just...
Well, to think about the site of the home as not work. Like, we have this whole structure.
That's ridiculous.
Right? But I mean in the specific sense of we have a place where people go and work together. We have a place where the network exists. We have a place where teamwork is expected. That's called the office.
Right, and why is that not the home? So
that's crazy.
Yeah.
So you think so being home with your baby becomes this sort of anti-teamwork space,
which is so stupid.
Which is not how it needs to be.
No, it's terrible.
So
it's terrible for
you're
mothers.
gonna feel like a failure because all the things that make you successful at work don't exist.
Right. Right. Yeah. Where's the team building exercises?
Exactly.
For the mother, right?
Where's my scrum in the morning? Who's got the bottles? Who's got the dishwasher? Right. Who's got the...
That's right. Didn't you say at one point, you're like, the amazing things I could do if I had staff, right? Like, Mama needs staff.
Otherwise known as everyone needs a wife.
That's right. That's right. Right, moms need help. So, and like, I love that quote from Commissar when she says, in our society, we have lost this circle of love among women, which leaves mothers isolated, confused, and alone at a time when they need care and support the most.
Yeah.
That's the circle of love.
And that has nothing to do with whether you're rich or poor in between.
No.
I mean...
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not about the finances.
It's like being alone in the suburbs, whether you have all the nice things or, you don't. That doesn't make a dang bit of difference.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and we've lost this circle of love because it's in the nature of the modern economy to turn relationships of care into jobs or into paid services. But I just want to put it on a more positive note, put a quick religious aside here. So, of course, the Catholic Church highly honors the Blessed Virgin Mary as sort of the mother par excellence. But what they also do, and this was new to me as a convert, they have this tradition that honors Mary's parents, Joachim and Anna, as holy and devoted. They even have their own feast day, July 26th. And there's this beautiful painting by Leonardo da Vinci called The Virgin and Child with St. Anne. It's so beautiful. And where Mary is like trying to grab naked toddler Jesus who's wrestling with a lamb and is kind of looking mischievous. And Mary has this really tired smile with what looks to me like bags under her eyes. But what's so beautiful is that Mary is sitting on her mother's lap. She's like supported by St. Anne, who has this very amused grandmotherly look on her face. And she's kind of looking both at Mary and at Jesus. And she's got her hand on her hip. And it's this sort of consummate image of the need for the mother to be mothered.
That's beautiful.
And so if even, the perfect mother, which is what Mary symbolizes, who gave birth to the perfect baby, needs support, then every mom does. Right, so 3 cheers for grandparents and extended family.
That's a very nice image. I have to say, a complete opposite popped into my mind at some point reading this book. I was thinking about we have to do eventually a fiction episode.
We do.
I want to read The Handmaid's Tale. I've read it before, but it was a zillion years ago.
We should.
And I was just thinking to myself, one of the things that happens in this sort of dystopian theocracy is they send the women home, which is, of course, in general, a very misogynistic, dystopian idea.
Yeah.
The idea that women are not allowed to work. It's very Taliban.
Yeah.
I mean, it is the Taliban. But it's funny because, you know, context is everything, right? Because if you had a baby and somebody sent you home for 3 years, that's what Commissar wants.
Right.
Like, if it was just normalized that women spent the early years with their children.
Yeah. With their children and with one another.
And with one another.
Yes.
But that's the thing. That's what I think at scale.
Yes. You gotta do it together.
Like, you could write this... I swear I should have just gone into writing, like, bad TV movies about random ideas I had. Because, you know, mothers stay home. There's a middle ground, I think, between the Taliban and, you know, claiming that it is completely anti-feminist for a woman to stay home with their kids. Like, there's got to be a middle ground there.
Yes, I'm sure there is. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. But you realize, like, those are the tripwires.
Yeah.
People think, oh, women aren't allowed to work. Taliban.
Right.
Like, that's literally what people think. The feminists, the career women, and the stay-at-home moms need to have a big conference and talk about, like, this meeting in the middle where how there could just be this attitude that if you're staying at home when your kids are young, it doesn't make you a stay-at-home mom in the sense that feminists love to...
Right.
You know what I mean?
And pigeonhole.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like, I feel like even the vocabulary is very...
That's right.
Because stay-at-home mom doesn't even have the same valence depending on which perspective you're looking at it from. That's like you were saying, like, it can be very highly valued to be a...
Yeah, I mean, the phrase stay-at-home mom within Christian circles, conservative Christian circles, is like,
it's like
well,
being CEO.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it very much is. It is more of a higher status. Right, and a woman would be kind of looked down on a little bit more in Christian circles for, oh, you're going to work for how many hours?
Right,
or like, part-time work is okay, but full-time. You know, it's completely inverted in sort of the status.
That's so weird.
Which gives its own set of problems.
Right. Well, it's like we were talking about before. It's like this, it's not about what it is. It's about what it signifies. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. And we're trying to get, Commissar is trying to get people to say, no matter what it signifies to you, here is the trade-off.
Right. So you have the facts. Make your decision, but make it aware of the impact on the child of what you do.
And especially for young women who maybe have received messages that it is not feminist, that it shows a lack of solidarity with other women not to make that choice to stay home. So, like, just drop that. Just screen that right out.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I think that would be the best way to honor what feminists fought for, which was the ability to choose.
Right. Yeah. To have options. Yeah. All right, before we end, I just wanted to have a little epilogue here. We got some good feedback from a regular faithful listener of the podcast, and so I just want to respond to that feedback briefly. We here at Red Femmes, we talk a lot about the meaning of gender, and so that means we often end up touching on transgenderism, which is a very complex issue that's surrounded on all sides with pain and difficulty. And we wanted to clarify that we bear no ill will towards people who are having the kind of experience that prompts them to describe themselves as transgender. I think it's possible to disagree with the way someone frames their experience, to disagree with the language they choose for themselves, with the changes they might want to make to the law, or with things that they do to their bodies, while still desiring that person's well-being and holding a stance of charity towards them and sympathy for the distress that they're going through and for the way that their illness manifests itself in self-harm. And I think we're trying to thread the needle here, to criticize certain ideas and beliefs as false and to criticize certain actions as wrong and harmful, at the same time as we recognize that these beliefs and actions are intertwined in the lives of real men and women who are suffering and confused, and who will hopefully find their way through this experience into a place of accepting their bodies and being integrated with their families and their communities. So all that to say is we wish them well.
We absolutely do.
We do. And I feel like I want to borrow something from the Mass that we always say. We have a time where we pass the peace, and we say, peace be with you, and the other person responds, and also with you. I don't know if we'll get an and also with you peace back, but our stance is peace be with you. And to any and all people who call themselves trans, we hope you find peace and healing and wholeness in body and mind. That's definitely my desire.
We absolutely do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So...
All right, so next time, to be determined.
To be determined.
Maybe some fiction. Maybe some two-parent privilege. Who knows?
We'll figure it out.
Maybe a retro. Maybe we throw it back.
Oh.
Do the second sex.
Oh yeah,
It's on
I
the
got
shelf.
that. I got that from the library,
Oh,
and then we
excellent.
didn't get to it, and then someone else needed it, so I had to return it.
Oh.
So I got to get on the list again.
All right. Well,
But all right,
we can do that.
till next time.
Till
Thanks
next
for
time.
joining us, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.